After I wrote How the Scots Invented the Modern World, a book that came up, in fact, earlier in our discussion, after it came out and drew enormous, I have to say, popular as well as critical acclaim, the story of how this small, underdeveloped, impoverished nation managed in the course of the 18th century to come up with the major ideas and institutions that govern modern life. The role of the Scottish Enlightenment, of Scottish thinkers, and then also Scottish engineers and others, and Scottish politicians in shaping the modern world. After the book became a New York Times bestseller, my uncle Norman, my mother's brother, their parents had come over from Norway just before World War I. My father's side of the family also has a Norwegian story, which you can actually read about, I talk about it in the Viking Heart, that goes back to his great-grandfather who came from Norway in the 1850s, sort of the earlier wave of Norwegian immigration. Anyway, so my uncle Norman said to me, he said, that's great. You've done this wonderful book on the Scots. Now, when are you going to do a book on the Vikings? And I didn't know quite what to say about that. I knew what my Uncle Norman was getting at. My Uncle Norman was a Sons of Norway stalwart, someone who was very much involved with the Minneapolis chapter. And I knew that what he was interested in was not just a book about the Vikings as an historical force, as a chapter in the history of Europe and the history of the West, but they would really be interested in hearing about, Scandinavian Americans and talking about the Viking legacy and how it reached across the Atlantic to America. And so I was intrigued by this idea, I have to admit. My original training as an historian at University of Minnesota and then at Johns Hopkins University was in medieval history. So I was pretty familiar with the story of the Vikings as a part of European history, as a part of the making of the medieval world. But it really wasn't clear to me how I was going to be able to shape this into something that would bring it up into the present. So I didn't follow through on my uncle's urging at that point. That was 20 years ago when How the Scots came out. And then in 2009, when my dual biography of Mohandas Gandhi and Winston Churchill won what was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, one of the 3 finalists for the Pulitzer Prize, my Uncle Norman again came through and said, that's great, that's really wonderful. What about those Vikings? When are you going to get around to a book on them? And so that was also, again, I was not really in a position at that point. I had thoughts about what I was going to do next. And in fact, the next book that was published after Gandhi and Churchill involved Scandinavians. That was the book called Freedom's Forge, How American Business produced victory in World War II, about the mobilization during World War II. And by golly, there were 2 very important Scandinavians at the story, at the center of the story. Bill Knudsen, who had been CEO of General Motors before Roosevelt called him to ask him to lead the effort to get America's industry geared up for modern mechanized warfare in the face of the growing Nazi threat. And then Charles Sorensen, who was a senior executive at Ford Motor Company, who was the great mastermind of the production of the B-24s at the Ford plant. Now, the fact that these happened to be Danes and not Norwegians did not deter me, because I did realize that there was, in other words, a story here about Scandinavian skill, about Scandinavian determination, the ability to shape reality in ways that would benefit and push forward the frontiers, not just of knowledge, but also the frontiers of the community itself. It was a very important one. And so bit by bit, the idea of a book that would tie the story of the Vikings as an historical force, that would be, if you like, an historical story um, an historical account of the Vikings' place in history as a ethnic as well as a political grouping, but then one that would also tie it in with the story today, even up to the present, was then beginning to come into my mind. And the result is the book that we're talking about tonight, which is The Viking Heart. And when the subtitle "How Scandinavians Conquered the World" came into my mind, it came into my mind not just as a way to describe the enormous success, the awesome success of the Vikings as explorers, as marauders, as traders and builders of a seafaring empire that reached across northern Europe and extended far beyond, eventually across the North Atlantic, but also about how the Scandinavian culture, the basic cultural skill set that enabled the Vikings to accomplish this amazing feat, how that had also become part of a global legacy, and how it helped us to understand how we got to where we are today, and perhaps where we need to go in the future as well. So that's the genesis of the book. And as I said, the first part of the book talks about the Vikings themselves. And it's a book that tries to address the issue of who are the Vikings, number one, but also what were they really like. And I felt that this was an important part of the story because, as you know, the usual view, especially in popular culture and in novels and films and so on, of the Vikings is something along the lines of the next slide. Bill, you can put it up. Right. This is a warrior piece from the famed Isle of Lewis chess set, now in the British Museum, which depicts almost certainly a Viking warrior of the type usually known as Berserkers. The Berserkers, these were, as you probably know, were warriors who had this sort of invincible spirit, this fury in battle that who had summoned up, as a description of Berserkers in Norse sagas and other sources describes them as summoning up their animal spirit of a bear, of a wolf, and so on. And this picture that we get from this image of the Vikings, of a race of super warriors, of perpetual marauders and pillagers and plunderers who inspired fear all across Northern Europe or wherever they went, is the one that kind of dominates our view about the Vikings. But as I try to explain in the book, and as I think many of you know already, the fact is this is only one part of the reality of the Viking world. And the role of Vikings, of the Scandinavian tribes as pillagers and marauders, which they certainly were, is only one part of their story. That this is, and perhaps not even the major part of it. That the real story about the Viking world and the world of Scandinavians, including of the early Norwegian tribes, is of people trying to eke out a living in a highly inhospitable environment. An environment, as we know, freezing cold, of incredible winters, scarce natural resources, very little arable land. Life is a struggle just to survive. And in this kind of environment, the development of a frame of mind, the development of a sense of that survival is about group survival. No one can survive in an environment like this alone. The group is necessary for everyone to be able to make it through those incredible winters in order to bring in a harvest from the small plot of land that's available here. And that in those circumstances, then we have to understand these Viking raids, the plundering raids, were an effort to find resources, to get the resources the community needed in order to survive, and to get it by any means necessary. And when it became clear at the height of the Viking era, which historians usually date to around 795, the Christian era, when we have the first large-scale raid, Viking raid on the English monastery at Lindisfarne on the eastern coast. And it lasts down until about 1066. The Battle of Hastings is usually identified as marking the end of the Viking Age. Then what we're really seeing is communities, Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, setting out every spring to find a way to get the resources that they need in order to keep their communities strong, in order to enable their communities to prosper. And it wasn't just by marauding, of course. It's also by trade, and it was also by establishing trading posts and trading links that enabled them to get the goods they needed, if not through war, then by peaceful exchange and commerce. And in fact, this chess piece itself is an indicator of both the reach of the Vikings, but also at the same time of the trading networks that they set up. Because, as I explain in the book, the new DNA research is able to show exactly where the ivory came from for this chess set, namely from the tusk of a narwhal from Greenland. This was, in other words, a tusk, a commodity that was part of a trading network that had been set up across the Atlantic, from Greenland to Iceland to the Scottish Hebrides, to the west coast, and then, of course, eventually to Scandinavia and Norway as well. So that's the real story about the Vikings. Okay, the next slide. It's the story of these incredibly people coming from a resource-poor land, underpopulated, but who bring to bear this enormous set of skills that enable them to venture out and to set forth in extraordinary places, and enabled by technology, and in particular the technology you see here, which is the characteristic shape of the Viking longship. Now this is a stone carving from Tanum in Sweden, which really shows you how early that distinctive longship design is. This goes back to the early years of the Iron Age, long before the Viking period, and yet we can already see the prows that almost look like that distinctive dragon shape that we associate with the Viking ships, and also the kind of broad beam, the long lines, sleek lines that we associate with Viking longships. In other words, this was centuries of nautical tradition for fishing, for engaging in trade, engaging in warfare with their neighbors, as the Scandinavians always did. The Vikings are always fighting among each other far more than they are with fighting with foreigners and engaging in battles with them. But the longship is the triumph, the achievement of centuries of nautical technology and development. Two parts. First, the longship design itself, and the skill that goes into creation of it. But then also, too, at the same time, the second technology, it comes in probably the 7th century AD, and that is the addition of a square sail, which turns the longship with its broad beam but shallow draft into an incredibly versatile instrument, not only for warfare, being able to move swiftly and strike at points and in regions where normally no one would expect the Vikings to penetrate. I mean, these were ships that were able to go from seagoing to river courses and to move deep inland, long before any enemy could even expect them to appear on the sea, to appear on the horizon. But also, too, to give them the endurance, the speed and endurance to cross seas, and eventually, of course, to cross oceans as well. So these two technologies, the longship and the square sail, revolutionize the Vikings' role in the world and turns them into, yes, the terror, the marauders feared by everyone in Northern Europe for more than 200 years, but also turns them into the transoceanic traders and explorers that it's such an important part of the real story of what the Vikings did and what they managed to achieve. The next slide. And of course, for the rest of the world, this was also a transformation. The sudden appearance of these Scandinavian tribes, Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, and everyone else that they brought along on their voyages. There you go. That's the one I want. And the incredible reach, the reach of these Vikings. At each of the parts of Scandinavia, taking on the division of labor, where they were going to go, and where the patterns of raiding and conquest and eventually settlement would unfold. In the case of the Danes, for example, much of their activities every spring reached across the North Sea to the east coast of England, but then down through northern France, around the coast of Spain, and eventually even penetrating as far as the eastern Mediterranean, reaching Athens and eventually and into the heartland of the ancient Mediterranean world. In the case of the Swedes, their spring voyages turned eastward, reaching across the Baltic and then down the river courses of Russia, the Dniester, the Dnieper, and the Don, reaching down, establishing on their way 2 large trading bases, which become their capitals. The capitals at Novgorod and then also at Kiev. Kiev was originally a Viking base and settlement there, which they expanded then to reach eventually to the Black Sea and finally to Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, which they attempted to siege unsuccessfully twice in the 9th century, but it makes them a formidable presence, both as a fighting force, but also as a trading and exchanging community in Eastern Europe. I talk about this at length in how the Swedish Vikings are transformed into the rulers of Russia, and even give Russia its name, because the term Rus was the term that local tribes gave to these Swedish interlopers in their presence. Rus meaning the men who row, which is a great description of Vikings working their way inland and along those river courses here. So there are Danes to the west, Swedes to the east, and then Norwegians reaching even further west, reaching across the northern tip of the British Isles to Scotland and Ireland, eventually to the Faroe Islands, to Iceland, Greenland, and then finally about 1,000, a couple of bands of the most intrepid will arrive on the coast of North America. The name usually associated with this being Leif Erikson, but we know both from the sagas and also from the archaeological evidence that it was not just his achievement alone, but it was in fact the achievement of an entire community who had set out from Greenland and who found ways to establish their connections here. The photograph that you see is of the part of the archaeological site discovered in the 1960s by archaeologists that really confirmed the fact that the stories of Viking landings in North America, conveyed in the sagas, described there, was now confirmed by the archaeological evidence. What kind of settlement? Well, what we know now from the archaeology is that it was probably a wintering landing site, the one that was set up at Lens au Meadow in Newfoundland, a settlement that was used for extending further trading networks all along the coast there, North America, which it seems the Norwegian explorers described in the sagas as Vinland. We don't know if there was a larger or a more permanent settlement in Vinland. No evidence has been found of it so far. But the evidence is pretty extensive that Norwegians were there, that they engaged in trade with the locals, and that at some point they closed up shop and headed back to their original base in Greenland. We don't know exactly why. Was there conflict with the native indigenous tribes there? that made it impossible for them to stay. The sagas suggest that, but we don't really know. We don't really have any confirmed evidence, no firm archaeological evidence yet. But the point is that this kind of reach, this incredible global reach, Russia from one end of the world to the shores of North America on the other, was all made possible by what this incredible community, the Scandinavian tribes, were able to accomplish here. And the achievement was one that was baffling to their outsiders. One, because they were such small population. Number two, because they came and went with such incredible speed. We talk about shock and awe, the shock and awe of Viking raids all across northern Europe and the British Isles. Arriving, taking what they want, grabbing the loot that they needed, disappearing before their enemies could even pull their act together and figure out a way in which to defend themselves. Also baffled by something else, and that was by the strange role that women had in Viking society too. That women were treated almost as equals in these extraordinary Scandinavian communities and in the expeditions that were engaged in. This was something that was quite shocking to outsiders, especially those from the Mediterranean world, who were used to a very strict segregation between the roles of men and women, women being very much set apart from and excluded from the larger social networks and political networks that sustain the community here. The Vikings were totally different. They were shocked by the fact that women had a number of legal rights in the Viking world. That they had, for example, a right to divorce. It was completely baffling to outsiders that women could apply for and achieve legal separation from their husbands under certain circumstances. They had limited rights of ownership of property, particularly if they were widows or single women, and that they were participants in, could be participants in the raids and expeditions that made the Vikings so notorious and so dangerous. We know from the saga evidence, for example, that women were very much part of the community that was set up in North America, including Leif Erikson's sister. And we know from DNA evidence that Viking women, were not only participants in some of the raiding expeditions that the Vikings engaged in, but particularly from the evidence at a burial site in Birka in Sweden, that they may even have led some of these expeditions. The sagas are very clear about that, but the archaeological evidence is now also beginning to take shape, confirming the fact that Viking women had this extraordinary role to play in their society, one very different, and we even say unique, compared to the societies and the communities around them. The other thing that was baffling to outsiders was their religion, the Norse religion, the pagan religion, which they held on to far longer than their Germanic cousins in the rest of continental Europe, that made them outliers from the larger forces of Christendom, the growth of Western Christianity. And it took a long time, as I explain in the book, for that Norse religion and the habits and the habits of mind and the culture mindset that went with that Norse religion, which Icelandic sagas poets would write down and record afterwards, centuries later. But at the same time, the coming of Christianity, get the next slide, is really an important watershed in the overall story. We know, for example, that Leif Erikson, although his father was Eric the Red was a pagan, was a Christian. Hence, you saw the cross on his chest from the statue there in Newfoundland. And the first Scandinavian king that we know, who really sort of is public about his conversion to Christianity, is King Harold of Denmark, known by his nickname, Harold Bluetooth, whose rune, as you see here, set up at Jelling in Denmark, as a public monument, a monument to his achievements as king. One of which includes not just uniting Denmark, but also of bringing Denmark into the Christian church. As I say in the book, and I'll tell you here, the process of getting Scandinavians, Norwegians, and Danes and Swedes to give up on the religion of Odin and Thor and Freya and the other great heroes and figures from Norse mythology took a long time. It was a long process with a stubborn populace holding on to the old ways. But in the end, I think it's an important part of our story. It's the story, part of the story of the Viking heart and the transformations that take place. Because what had happened with the Viking community had been the development of a powerful skill set, a skill set which was built around the idea of community survival, of all joining together, working together towards a common goal, which really was survival in the final analysis, but also at the same time, a recognition that individuals had to be free to follow their own path, to find new ways to venture out, to take risks, to go find the things, the goods, the discoveries that would come back to benefit the whole. And so you have this extraordinary balance between, on the one hand, community solidarity and sort of the cultural ties that bind together the group, the tribe, the community, ultimately the nation, Norwegian nation, Swedish nation, Danish nation. But on the other side, balanced by this willingness to let individuals follow their own path, to look for their own direction of what it is that will benefit the community, to make up their minds about what it is that will benefit all and bring and advance the interests of the whole. And Christianity adds, I think, an important element to this. It adds it, first of all, with the idea of conscience, of the role of individual conscience as an important part of our understanding of our relationship with others, which goes a long way to change, shall we say, the more ferocious aspects of Viking culture and Scandinavian culture from the Viking Age as it transitions to the Middle Ages. But also, too, I think another part of it is it gives an added sense of the spiritual value of the community that's held together here, not by the rites and rituals of the pagan past, but are bound together with the sacred bonds, the sacrosanct bonds that tie all Christians together, men and women, and all individual souls into one community. And that's a powerful part of Scandinavian culture, I think. I would even argue right down to today. And the coming of Lutheranism, which I talk about in the book, by the way, an important chapter on that, I think, adds to that ingredient because of Luther's insistence that it isn't just the priestly class, it isn't just the clergy or monks or nuns or priests who enjoy a vocation in the eyes of God, but all human beings do. Everyone does, in every calling of life. That what we do and doing the best that we can and working to achieve excellence in all that we do is a form of brotherly love. It's a form of our respect and connection with each other. It's what I call the Lutheran work ethic. And it's a very, very much a part of what happens within Scandinavia and that shapes it in the post-Viking Age is this element of the sense that there is something sacred about the ties that bind us together as a community in which each individual both has value, but also has a responsibility to make that contribution to keep the community as strong as possible. And again, for men and for women. Go to the next slide. And even in the Middle Ages, even in this period of time when Scandinavia kind of drops out of the larger struggles for power of medieval Europe between kings of France and England, and Holy Roman emperors and kings of Spain, even during this period, we still see the important role of women, the respect for women. And I talk about three of the most important of that group, the Swedish saints, Saint Bridget of Sweden, Queen Ingeborg of Norway, who was the woman who really brought the kingdoms of Norway and Denmark together as a political union through her political skill and through her ability to achieve her goals in the political sphere. And then finally, the woman you see here, who is Queen Margaret of Sweden, Queen Margaret of Denmark, Queen Margaret of Denmark, who manages to achieve before her death in 1412 what no other political figure in all of Scandinavian history, before or since, was able to achieve, and that was to unite all three crowns together as one, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, through the Union of Kalmar, which was signed in 1397, a formal recognition that all three of these kingdoms would come together, not under Queen Margaret, although they were willing to offer her the crown, as I explained in the book here, but rather through her stepson. But she did realize it was more important for her to be the power behind the throne as opposed to the power of sitting on the throne here. She's an extraordinary figure. I talk about her and her incredible will, her incredible ability to force the ruling classes of three kingdoms to obey her will, to submit to her demands here. One of the most extraordinary women in history, not just Scandinavian history here. But I think she is also, again, a tribute to the fact that we see the role of powerful women in Scandinavian history, shaping the destiny and shaping the forces afterwards. Next slide. The other extraordinary figure that comes out of Scandinavian history through this period of time has to be Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, who during the 30 Years' War takes on the Catholic Counter-Reformation and basically saves Protestant Europe from being overrun by the Habsburg powers and by the powers that be here. The greatest soldier of his age, the greatest statesman of his age, a man who really turned the Sweden from, again, underpopulated and rather poor part of Europe into a European superpower. And it really makes the 17th century in many ways the Scandinavian century. Now, if my Norwegian grandmother here, she would want to know why I'm talking so much about Swedes in this discussion and in this lecture. I would simply point out to her that her son, Uncle Norman, did go to Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota, and so the connection there isn't entirely coincidental from that point of view. But Gustavus Adolphus is important for our story for another reason, in the larger picture, and that is that extraordinary man though he was, a man who really was able, through his military skill, to get Sweden to hit above its weight, way above its weight, as a European great power, all the way through to the 17th and into the 18th centuries. Sweden and Denmark and the Norwegians, who find themselves being in dependency of first one and then the other in the course of modern history during this period. Although they're able to play the role of great power, they pay a terrible price for it. And that is all of the resources that are poured into maintaining armies and empires and wars of conquest is all money and resources that doesn't go in to improving the economies and modernizing the social and economic systems of all three countries, of all three nations. And the price that's paid for it is that Scandinavia really misses out on the big economic transformations that are affecting the rest of Europe, England and France and Spain and the Low Countries, Netherlands. The great explosion of trade in the 17th century, even though that trade across the Atlantic, the original precursors had been the Vikings for that transoceanic trade. And then the coming of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. All of these are broad socioeconomic trends that completely passed Scandinavia by. So that by the middle of the 19th century, when Scandinavia experiences this enormous increase in population. It's an enormous increase in population explosion, which the population of Norway nearly doubles in a matter of a couple of decades. There's no way to feed all the new mouths. And so Scandinavians poorest, Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, Finns, all have to make a decision. And that is that it becomes impossible for them to stay in their own homeland. They have to go elsewhere. And beginning in the mid-19th century, more and more of them choose America and the United States. And this is an important point to realize, I think, when we think about the Scandinavian immigration to America. Get the next slide. Is that, of course, part of it was, an enormous part of it was the pull of the fact that they had to escape poverty, and that there was a promise of land and of being able to pursue your own livelihood and find your own life for yourself and your family on the other side of the Atlantic in America. And when we think about settlers and immigrants coming to the broad acres of the Midwest and Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin and the Dakotas, as my father's great grandfather did, what we find here is that what would seem to be, as you see from this picture, a rather sort of bleak landscape from a modern point of view. This sort of sod covered log cabin out in the midst of nowhere. There's this prairie. What would seem a rather sort of desolate landscape to anyone else, that to a Scandinavian, to a Norwegian, is this unbelievable paradise. I mean, it's like acres as far as you can go. You can plow all day, and never come to an end to it. And it's all flat, unlike arable acres in Norway, which often come at a slant, 25 degrees at least in those conditions here. That the ability to find a life for yourself and build a life in a land of incredible plenty was definitely one of the key draws for Scandinavian immigrants coming to America. It really was a land of riches from their point of view, compared to the poverty that they left behind and the meager resources that they had to find. But at the same time, of course, they brought enormous skills with them, the skills that had been honed of carving out a life for yourself in the wilderness that was Norway, Sweden, Finland, here, of having to clear acres and acres of forest land, for example, in order to get enough land to plow. The skills in working in forest, which of course is why so many Scandinavian immigrants would end up in the lumber camps, both in the Midwest and then of course eventually in the Northwest as well. And at the same time too, that kind of dedication to hard work, of knowing that community survival was the key for survival of the individual as well. It made them the perfect immigrants for the American frontier in the 19th century. They bring a skill set with them that is, I think, really essential to what they're able to achieve and bring about. But there was also another draw that I talk about in the book, which we mustn't also forget. And that was what drew them to America was the fact that America was the land of liberty, that it was a republic, that it was a place where individuals enjoyed a freedom from the social strictures and requirements, including religious strictures of the Lutheran churches and the church establishments in their home territories and in their homeland, and that brings them to America to become part of this land of liberty, to enjoy the rights of free-born citizens in a republic rather than in a kingdom. Here, next slide. And that is why so many of them will become, and when they arrive in the 1850s, that first wave, so many will be drawn to the Union cause when the Civil War breaks out. and will become dedicated unionists to fight a war to end slavery. I mean, this is the whole key for them. How could a land of liberty be one in which slavery survives as an institution, and even that those defending slavery would break that union and destroy it in this way? And that is almost certainly why it is that my great-great-grandfather, Ivar Jakobsen Sorley, when he came from Norway in the 1850s, was drawn to this man, Hans Christian Haig, from Wisconsin, who raised the volunteer regiment of Scandinavian volunteers, the 15th Wisconsin, which became known as the Scandinavian Regiment, as a matter of fact, because there were so many Scandinavians on the muster roll, and who would lead that unit into battle during the Civil War, including at the Battle of Stones River, where my great-great-grandfather was seriously wounded, and in fact was invalided out of the service because of his wounds at Stones River in December 1862. But Haig is a magnificent figure. He must have been a heroic speaker, recruiting Norwegians and Danes and Swedes from all across Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa to become part of the 15th Wisconsin Regiment, who was also too deeply dedicated to the fact that this was a war not just to preserve the Union, but also to end slavery, and whose father, I'll make a note of this, and I talk about this in the book, was also an extraordinary figure, a newspaper publisher, who published one of the first Norwegian newspapers in the United States. And that was an extraordinary thing to do, because we're talking about almost 60 years before Norwegian independence, at a time when, back in the old country, there was still a debate about whether Norwegian was a real language or not. You know, a lot of scholars and a lot of politicians, particularly Danish politicians, were very insistent, and Swedish politicians too, I might add, were very insistent that in fact there was no Norwegian language, that it was simply a Danish dialect. And it's in the 1840s and 1850s that you get the dissenting voices of Norwegians saying, no, we have our own history, we reach back to our remote past, the Viking past here, and that Norwegian is a distinct language, and therefore is that the Norwegians form a distinct ethnic and linguistic and national community for whom ultimately independence is due. So Haig's father was, by publishing a newspaper in Norwegian in America, was really making a kind of revolutionary statement. He was really talking about the fact that Norwegians formed their own community, a community now which had become part of a larger community, namely the United States, a community to which Haig Sr. gave his son's life, killed at the Battle of Chickamauga, that my great-great-grandfather almost lost his leg as a result of the wounds that he suffered, but that it's an important part of the story, not just the American Civil War, but also about what it is that draws the Scandinavians and made them part of that history. Okay, the next slide. And so what this book has been about is about what I'm calling the Viking Heart. That's the title of the book. But it's really about that cultural skill set that I've been talking about in the course of this lecture. The skill set that developed before the Vikings, that made the Vikings such an incredibly powerful and transformative force in European history, and I would say even in global history in many ways, that lived on and developed in Scandinavia after the Viking Age, took on new attributes thanks to the coming of Christianity and the coming of the Lutheran Reformation. And it was transplanted and carried over to America by those Scandinavian and Norwegian immigrants when they came over to create new lives for themselves and their families, and brought that skill set, that Viking heart with them. But of course, the Viking heart didn't die out in Scandinavia itself. It continued to be part of the warp and woof of the culture there. And in finishing this lecture, I can't think of a better example of this and a better person to end it with than someone who really became one of my heroes in the course of writing the book, I must admit to you. and whose birthday was just celebrated on October 10th. And that's Fridtjof Nansen. Fridtjof Nansen, who was born to a family of Norwegian sea captains and sailors, who was an avid outdoorsman and avid sports and winter sports enthusiast, skiing. As you see him here, a picture on his set of skis and skater and so on. You know, when he went to the University of Oslo, the reason he decided that Fridtjof Nansen decided he was going to study zoology was his hope was that way he could spend all his time outdoors rather than in a classroom, because that was his life. That's where he felt happiest and most connected with it. And so it was not surprising then he became an intrepid Arctic explorer. When he wrote his book about his experiences as an Arctic explorer, Nansen even says, you know, the Vikings were the first. They were the first of the great polar explorers, setting out in their ships and confronting the ice of the far north here. And his exploits as an explorer, as a polar explorer, made him world famous. As I talk about it in the book, crossing the ice pack of Greenland in the middle of winter, the first person to do that. Getting closer to the North Pole than anyone else had gotten with his ship, the Fram, in a series of other polar expeditions which inspired Roald Amundsen. He's the inspiration for what Amundsen had accomplished, because he was a role model for all of these, should we say, would-be Vikings setting out on their explorations and directions here at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And you can see that if you think about him as this illustration of him from a Norwegian newspaper clearly is playing up on his sort of Viking, right? This Viking heart attributes. And there he is. He could be, you know, a Viking warrior. Could be Leif Erikson in the picture that we have of him now. But it's also important to realize that's only, again, part of who Fridtjof Nansen really was. Because as he got older, and in the aftermath of the First World War, of which Norway, newly independent in 1905, stayed out as a neutral party. But Nansen was appalled at what had happened to Europe, to the civilized world as a result of that conflict. You know, after Norwegian independence, he was appointed as the first Norwegian ambassador to Great Britain. So he had a good understanding of what was taking place there, what was happening in Great Britain and experiences of the war. And he threw himself into the causes to try and alleviate the suffering of the millions of people left behind whose lives had been shattered. Ordinary people, not soldiers, but civilians and refugees in the course of that war. Got the last slide? And that's the other Fridtjof Nansen. It's the other one, the philanthropist, the man who becomes really the symbol of the League of Nations as an organization dedicated to relieving human suffering, as its successor, the United Nations, has taken on afterwards. And his achievements, which I talk about him in the book, are extraordinary for the time, extraordinary at any time, of a single-minded determination to relieve suffering in the world wherever he could find it, and of taking steps to make the lives of refugees, of those whose lives have been disrupted by war, by invasion, the terrible suffering after the Russian Revolution, for example, which he tried to alleviate, that would make him, again, a major figure in the world affairs, a symbol of philanthropy on this incredible scale, and would eventually in 1922 win him the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. You know, they say that it's said that Fridtjof Nansen is the first person to coin the phrase that what is difficult takes a little while, what is impossible takes a little longer. And as I say in the book, one could even say that that's the motto of the Viking Heart, that ability to achieve the impossible, to see the importance of of all of us working together to achieve the goals that we all need to achieve. That with freedom comes at the same time a responsibility of the community as a whole, to make our efforts merge with others, to connect with others, because that's how we survive. That's how we function together as a community. That's what the Viking Heart is really all about. And what that skill set that the Vikings developed and brought forth looks very different when we look into the eyes of someone like Fridtjof Nansen and look at his record and his achievements as a philanthropist, as a man who dedicated his life not to opposing suffering, but to alleviating it. And yet I would say it's the same culture, it's the same skill set that we see applied and that animates the story that I wanted to tell in the Viking Heart.
A question?
Sure, go ahead.
If we're asking questions now.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to write the book, Arthur?
Well, let's see. It was basically a 2-year process. Most of my books, I usually manage to work on it, between the research and the writing is usually a 2-year process. Now, I was fortunate because since I did have this background in medieval history, writing about the Vikings wasn't entirely new territory, shall we say. And so but it was interesting because now I was sort of seeing it from the other side, because I was a student of medieval England, medieval France, the development of institutions in Northern Europe. And the Vikings were always kind of, they were the pushful outsiders, right? Who kind of appear on the stage, create a lot of disruption for a long period of time, and then mercifully disappear, right? I mean, that's kind of how medieval historians usually think about the Vikings. So I had that basic grounding in it. But I think that's also what allowed me to think about the Vikings in a different light and to think about it. What if you turn the story inside out? And you thought about how the Vikings saw the other parts of Europe and their interactions with them. And that's really what I wanted to do with the book, was to bring that overall story to bear in ways that would be interesting to someone who was a student of the Middle Ages, interested in European history, as well as the story about Scandinavian Americans, Norwegian Americans, when they came over here. That was really the newest and in many ways the most fascinating part of the work.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
I live in a retirement community, and we have a group here called Nordic Friends, and we've been watching the Great Courses series on the Vikings. And today's topic was the Norse gods, and
Sure.
we were wondering how the days of the week got named after so many Norse gods.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do the naming. You mean, for example, Wednesday, right? After Wotan Day, right? And Freya as for Friday,
Right.
and so on. A lot of that is carried over from the German legacy. It's not strictly a Viking legacy.
Okay.
It's the Germanic legacy, because of course the Germanic tribes, who, as I say, talk about them in the earliest part of the book, they all came out of southern Scandinavia, and so they brought with them the same religion, right? The same Norse gods came with them, and those days of the week then become integrated into first Old German, and then into Middle High German, and then into Modern German as well. So it's via the German tribes, not necessarily the Vikings as such.
Thank you.
They managed to make their way into it. But it is interesting, they all come out of southern Scandinavia, as I explain in the book. They were really the smart ones, because they said, we don't have to put up with these winters. We can go find land in which to, cultivate fields and raise our cattle and raise our families without having to put up with the conditions here. And it's the Vikings and their ancestors who stuck it out.
Yeah, I don't have so much of a question as a comment, and I like your feedback. Isn't
Sure.
it the nomadic characteristic of the Vikings that repressed their adoption of the written word hence their storytelling and saga that came about.
Well, you know, I talk a good deal about this, Thor, in Viking Heart, and I think your characterization of the nature of Viking and then later Scandinavian culture as basically an oral culture instead of a written culture is absolutely spot on. And we see, you know, good evidence of that is of the runes themselves, the runic alphabet, which was used really almost for almost a kind of shorthand. You know, it was used for large public monuments. It was used for inscriptions done by individuals talking about, you know, what they had done and who their family was, and gravestones and so on. But it was never used and never exploited as a written language for record keeping, for writing down chronicles, for doing any other kinds of things that you expect with a written culture. And what that I think you're right. I think it gives Viking culture unique qualities, but also Scandinavian culture afterwards too. Because the coming of the written word, which in medieval Europe means Latin, written Latin, comes very late to the Scandinavian kingdoms. If I'm not mistaken, the very first Latin book, manuscript, of course not printed, the very first manuscript Latin book in Denmark dates from the 11th century. 11th century, we're talking about, you know, 2,000 years, right? After the Greeks had wrote down, you know, the poems of Homer, 2,000 years. I mean, and then you think about that compared with, for example, the Jews and their relationship with the written word. It's an extraordinary difference. And I think it is, as Thor suggested, gives a different shape to the stories of the Norse sagas because they come right out of that oral tradition of storytelling, you know, around the fire, if you like, storytelling with stories that are kind of open-ended and that are never quite the same, you know, from one night to the next, depending on who your audience is and who the storyteller, and keeping them awake and keeping them interested and so on. I mean, that gives, I think, the Norse sagas a peculiar and I think a really appealing character about them too. Because there's a spontaneity to them in a way in which other kinds of medieval literature, which believe me, I spent a lot of time studying as an undergraduate, graduate student, just doesn't have that kind of spark and that kind of quality to it. But it's a very interesting question, and as I say, it's one that I find that is worth that I wanted to explore in the book as well.
Well, I have a question.
Sure.
And I think it's very interesting that you have studied the Vikings, but you also studied the Scots earlier on. And I'm wondering if there's a connection there. And the reason I'm asking is that I have a cousin who extensively looked into our family history. It turns out his mother's Norwegian, his father was Scottish, and he seems to have found more connections back to the Viking era on the Scottish side than he has
for the Norwegians.
Largely because they can write.
Right. Well, the written evidence, but then let's not also forget the new evidence that flows from the DNA analysis.
Yeah.
Here as well, and people being able to sort of trace their genomic heritage in ways that just wasn't possible, 20 years ago. It wasn't imaginable to do that.
He was doing it, some time ago, but he was fascinated with trying to connect to Harford, which apparently a lot of people try to do. But he maintained that he had been able to trace back to 3 different wives of Harald Harford on the Scottish side. And of course, these go back to, goes back to presumably Viking settlers in the different islands north of Scotland, and so these chieftains perhaps became kings and lords and whatever, and obviously wrote things down.
And constantly intermarried, and found daughters and sons for their families with the locals. I have a couple chapters talking in the book about the Vikings in the British Isles, And the degree to which, I mean, in England, good heavens, you know, at one point, 2/3 of the Kingdom of England was Danish territory, right? And we know that the Norwegian connection, particularly in the north in Scotland, and then across to Ireland, is very deep, both culturally, and it's reflected, as you were saying, in the written records, but it's also very much reflected in the DNA evidence too. The numbers of people of Irish descent right now who, you know, go have their DNA tested, right, and are astonished to discover that in fact that they're actually Norwegian. It's a dismaying thing. I mean, the numbers of recruits for Sons of Norway should swell tremendously, you know, as knowledge of where their real family roots are, connections are. But you know, I'll tell you this: there is I sensed this was going to happen when I was writing the Scots book, and I'll tell you why. And that is that my father's Norwegian family name is Sorley, right? And of course, in Scotland, there is a Scottish clan called the MacSorleys. It's not at all an uncommon name in Scotland. And in Scotland, Sorley means summer traveler. And I can't think of a better euphemism to describe a Viking raider than summer traveler as a connection with that. So I had an inkling, Howard, that there was going to be a connection here, even in my own family, between Scots and Norwegians. And writing this book has just simply confirmed what my instincts told me were true from the beginning.
So I have a question. I'm always curious about Native Americans. So what is the Viking, you've got Newfoundland and the places up there, but I understand that sometimes some of they're not Yupik, but they're part of the Eskimo community. They have certain sculptures that really look, that's my dog.
Well, that's your dog, well, I'll tell you, the DNA research that has been done in Greenland doesn't really turn up a lot of Scandinavian connection. And so as I explained in the book, what really happened to the Greenland, the Norse settlers in Greenland, we don't really know. It's not entirely clear. Maybe they cleared out and went back to Iceland. Maybe they were wiped out. It's also possible. Relations with the Native Americans in Greenland and then also in North America, certainly the saga evidence in North America suggests things did not go smoothly, that there was a lot of conflict, which the sagas, of course, put the blame firmly on the Native Americans for the difficulties, you know. But my guess is that the real issue is what ultimately doomed Viking, or I guess we can call it Norwegian settlement in North America, right after Leif Erikson, that really doomed it, was the steady eclipse of the Greenland settlement. As its population shrank away and as trade became less and less important to Iceland and then eventually to Norway, to the North American settlement probably just withered on the vine. I don't do that as a deliberate pun on Vinland, but it's very, very clear that the demand for the goods that were coming from North America, one of which seems to have been lumber, you know, not a lot of forest land in Greenland, let alone in Iceland, but plenty in North America and in Newfoundland. That as the demand diminished, there just didn't seem to be any point in maintaining that connection over the next couple of centuries.
I have a question.
Please.
Do you think the Viking heart is still beating, and especially in like the Scandinavian countries? If so, how does it manifest itself?
Well, that's a really good question, isn't it? I think it does. I think it comes in a variety of guises, and I think part of it. I think you see it in two ways. I think just off the top, I talk about them in the book.
Okay.
One is on the social welfare state. The development of the Scandinavian, we call the Scandinavian welfare state. I talk about how that came about, what its origins were. But one of the reasons why the welfare state has been so successful, not just in Norway, but also Sweden and Denmark and Finland, right? And the elaborate growth of a government-sponsored, welfare system from cradle to grave. In effect, one of the reasons why is because that strong sense of community solidarity. If you're a part of the community, you deserve our help, you deserve our support. It goes without question. But with it also goes a sense of responsibility. If you can work, you should work. You're part of the community. That means your effort is also part of the requirements that go with it. And so the balance between, on the one hand, strong commitment to welfare state, but at the same time, a strong commitment to entrepreneurial capitalism, right? None of these welfare state apparatuses could exist without a strong capitalist economy. Sweden, Norway, so it's Denmark, it's all fundamental to making it go. Iceland as well. It goes without saying, yeah, we're going to, that this is part of it that makes those societies helpful. And I see it very much in that light. I see it very much in that light of the Viking heart. Strong community ties, loyalty, community, we're all together in this, but we also recognize individuals have to take their own direction and have to take responsibility for their own actions in order for this enterprise, this common enterprise, to work and succeed at the same time. The second one I was going to point to has been the response to COVID, which has been totally different from the rest of Europe. No one can understand what's going on there, right? The Swedes, and each was different, right? The Swedes were different from the Norwegians, which were different from the Danes. And yet at the same time, the fact that each of them arrived at a response which was not complete and total lockdown, shutdown on the one hand, right? But there was also at one in which the excess death rate simply didn't grow as fast as the experts predicted. If you're not going to lock down, you're going to have an enormous growth in terms of excess death rate. It didn't happen in the Nordic countries. And I think a lot of it is because people took responsibility upon themselves to protect each other in those circumstances. It didn't require government mandates to make the Scandinavians be careful in dealing with each other and watching out for each other in the course of a pandemic of this kind. And so the Nordic response, I don't think it's one that was reproducible, which is interesting. I think the Viking heart is. I think that the skill set we can do it now. We're doing it now. It's there, waiting to be tapped into now, I believe, in post-COVID America. I feel that very strongly. I really do, Marie, I really do. But in this case of the Scandinavians and their response to COVID, good luck trying to figure out a way in which that's a model for doing it anywhere else. But it is what it is that makes them the Nordic countries so unique and so different.
One other aspect of the Nordic countries is how good they are in sports, particularly team sports. And
That's
for
right.
a country like Norway to win, a small country like Norway to do so, or even more Iceland, to do so well in team sports is incredible because they have such a small population. Then they can regularly beat teams with huge populations, is incredible. Another aspect, one of the things you were saying is that the cold conditions affect the Norwegian temperament because of the need for solidarity. I would also suggest that the cold conditions develop a mindset of planning and thinking ahead. If you live in a temperate climate where fruit falls on the tree, you don't have to plan ahead. If you one of the things they're mentioning is the way that Norway handled its oil wealth. A number of countries, Russia, and some of the Latin America, Venezuela had this huge influx of money because of petroleum and oil wells. And I think Venezuela and Russia and some of the others have had real problems. Norway has actually managed it intelligently. And it's one of the few examples of countries that have collectively disciplined themselves to manage things in terms of not the present, but the future.
Yep, the story of the Norwegian energy sector is again, it's a unique story in many ways, but so characteristic of that element of what some call the Scandinavian secret, but which I call the Viking heart. So do we have time for maybe one more question?
Oh, sure. Anyone?
I'll ask. This is Shelley. I'm trying to understand how many Vikings, and did I understand, were the Vikings not only Norwegian, but they were also Danish and Swedish and Scandinavian too?
And Finns and Slavs and whoever is willing to set out in a boat and row for your life across the Atlantic, you count as a Viking.
Okay, and then when did they start to dissolve? What brought about them not being around anymore?
Well, I think two enormous. That's an excellent question. And when we come think about the passing of the Viking Age, which I talk about in detail in the book, but I'll give you a short answer so we can finish up. The short answer is this: number one is the Viking raids come to an end because eventually the people that they're preying on learn how to defend themselves, and the development of realizing that it's going to have to be local communities through a process of self-help, of basically finding ways to raise their own armed men and armed contingents to deal with the Vikings with the defense in depth. Vikings start to lose, it's no longer profitable to engage in raids because you get beaten. And that's a powerful incentive to stop being, Vikings as in the films and in TV series. That's number one. But the other big change is Christianity. There's no doubt about that, because it makes the Northern Europeans no longer, right, enemies, no longer aliens. They're now fellow Christians. And the development of institutions like the Catholic Church that bridge the differences between Scandinavian culture and the mainstream Western culture, right? Smooth out the edges of Viking life and of the tribal warfare, and leads to the development of large-scale kingdoms in which maintaining peace and order is a priority, instead of sending out everybody in the spring to go and see what they can steal. Makes a big difference. Those two things, I think, mark really the end of the Viking era. After 200 years of scaring everybody else to death.
Thank you.
Thank you.